Batu, Barada, Nikto.
You must remember those words.
Gordon's alive.
You know what the Turing test is?
I know Kung Fu.
Dead or alive, you are coming with me.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Stories Out of Time and Space. I'm your regular host, Scott Weatherly, and as always, I'm joined by Julian Darius. Julian, how are you doing? You okay?
Oui, ça va, et toi?
I knew it was going to come up. I thought about trying to do introductions in French, and then I was like, thought better of it, thinking I'm going to be doing this with someone who's fluent in French, and I'm going to make myself look daft.
Well,
Thought
I
better
do
of
that
it.
anyway.
That's true.
You're not supposed to be that enthusiastic.
No, I make myself look, we're always making ourselves look daft. Today we are dipping back into French cinema with the 1991 dark comedy Delicatessen from someone we've recently been talking about, Jean-Pierre Juin, who directed Alien Resurrection. So I think this is a first for us, where we've done sort of like the same director in such quick succession on the show. Completely by accident, but it works well. So yeah, 1991's Delicatessen, post-apocalyptic surrealist. We'll talk about that. Black comedy about the landlord of an apartment building who occasionally prepares a delicacy for his odd tenants. I think that focuses too much on the landlord. I feel that the tenants are actually take up more of the space in this. And they're oddities, and they're also wonderfully weird characters. But yeah, let's start with that. So, Julian, what are your first initial thoughts then on Delicatessen?
Well, I remember seeing this shortly after it came out. And I was not immediately taken with it. I liked it okay. I like the aesthetic of it. And I sort of like the quirky characters. It's sort of like, pre Wes Anderson,
Yes.
sort of quirky characters, which is great. I think that all of that stuff works for the most part. I think that, it does kind of drag and becomes kind of like farcical. There's stuff that works and stuff that doesn't really, but yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's sort of both charming and underwhelming, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel about Wes Anderson, to be perfectly honest, in a nutshell. Really. So yeah, no, I know exactly what you mean. I really like this film in the sense of exactly that. I like the aesthetic. I think there's a quirkiness. There's a sort of a whimsical sort of ideal to it. I saw a phrase that described this as the comfortable uncanny. Like it's not enough to really freak me out, but it's like enough to set people on edge. But the problem with it is because it's kind of plotless. It reaches a point where it's quite clear it's not entirely sure what to do with its time. So the second act just sort of meanders around and sort of like dances around this idea of the cannibalism at the center of this, and then remembers, oh, we need to get to a third act, and so we're going to introduce. They're mentioned, but we're going to introduce sort of these troglodytes kind of characters, the underground characters, and then we're going to rush to a finale, and it all becomes a little bit of a mess. So I think I prefer the first half of the film to the second. But yeah, no, there's some good bits in this that I will sort of mention I really enjoyed, but the quirkiness kind of ends up getting in the way towards the end to sort of producing something that's coherent. And that kind of bothered me, especially in the third act.
I agree with you. I mean, I think that there's a little bit of a adjustment to the film. I think it's sort of like it starts with a sort of cannibalism joke, and sort of like is a little slow initially going, but then you sort of settle into all the quirky characters and sort of every quirky character kind of like gets a scene or two, or and some of it's quite charming and amusing. And then you get to that third act and you're like, oh, we're just in farce territory where all the characters are running around. They're all doing something, but it's really hard to keep it all straight, and then you start thinking like, well, the day they decide to kill the new guy is the day that, these people attack. And yeah, that makes sense because, the woman who loves him gets them to attack, but, still it's like there's a fire and then
Yeah.
there's a flood and it's just kind of it's a little out of control, but it also is hard to follow. I think
Yes.
one of the things that I most dislike about this is that it's hard to follow and keep all of the characters straight and keep where they are in the building straight, and you just kind of get a sense of everything's happening at once.
Mm. I'm glad you said that because I didn't. I was like, I don't know if I'd missed points or because of the. I followed the sub. Though I don't have a. There wasn't a dub available for this, or I watched sort of the subtitles. So I was like, have I missed a line or an explanation for something? So we'll get to that because once the um uh Julie, the daughter of the butcher, ends up having some sort of like is in cahoots with the troglodyte or the trogglers, whatever they're called, characters. Beyond that, I'm a little bit lost with some of the things that are going on and why they're all I know why they're creeping up into the loft to save um Lewison, the character, but like it all gets a bit confused and messy and as you say
Yeah,
farcical, but
it's
not in
it's
like
hard to keep it all straight, and
yeah.
also scenes kind of cut. Like this is a low budget movie.
Mm,
It doesn't feel that way. They do a great
mm-mm.
job, but I mean, this is a low budget film, and basically on one set, right? This whole building,
Yeah.
and so they do sort of like cut, and there's stuff where it's not really clear exactly what happened, except for like a line of dialogue that follows it, and you just kind of have to remember, oh yeah, those characters are dead, you
Yeah.
know. Um, so I do think that it can be kind of hard to follow.
Yeah. But before we get to that point, let's go back to the beginning because I also think the opening, the quirkiness of it, this film kind of asks not a lot. Let's just say it's not asking a lot of you, but it's going to keep you off kilter. Like it's going to keep you're not. It becomes a problem at the end. Let me put it that way. But a lot of the fun of this film is actually not always knowing entirely what the hell's going on. Like it keeps feeling uncanny and off kilter. And the opening to this film is this guy is wrapping himself in like rubbish and paper and tape, and then he puts on the hat to make it look. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? Then he climbs inside a bin, and you realise it becomes clear he's trying to escape the building as rubbish. And I was like, oh, I love that. It's really. I mean, this whole film's really well shot for the most part. I love watching it. Um, but the comedy's kind of weird and dark and quirky. And then when he's found out, like, you just see the butcher open the lid, there he is, and then sort of it transfers to the next day, and he's serving his customers with lumps of butchered meat. So like you're like, oh, I'm kind of going to assume from what they've sold me or
Hmm.
what they've shown me is this guy was served up as um the chunks of meat that he then serves to his tenants that he owns the building. You don't really know that. You learn that again as it goes on. Um, and then this new guy turns up, Louison, played by Dominic Pinon, also in Alien Resurrection.
Yeah,
Um,
and in basically all of his films, like
yeah,
he's in Amelie, he's in sort of everything that this guy's very unique looking guy. He's got kind of a pronounced chin. I really love this dude's look.
he has a very I would say there's a lot of unique looking. They're like attractive
Mm.
in a unique and an unusual way. Like they're not. No one's entirely like. This is really harsh. It's horrible. No one's entirely ugly, but they're very well presented. But they're very unique. And he has quite a good look. He has an unusual face. And
I love that. To me, that's very French, right?
yes,
Everybody is sort of like not conventionally attractive, but kind of,
attractive.
attractive in their own
Yeah,
sort of unique way.
yeah. Every
That does
character in
strike me
this,
as very
I
French.
felt that with like, every character in this. I was like, oh, you're kind of interesting looking, and I appealing, but like not conventionally attractive. Um, he comes in and sort of has all this stuff, and he then just happens to be able to become the new handyman.
Well, and it's pretty clear that they're running a scam, right? I mean,
Yes.
so there's some sort of apocalypse that's happened, right? I mean,
Hmm.
because you see the exterior of the building and it's collapsed, and
Smog, and it's all, yeah.
yeah, so it's pretty clear that they're running a scam whereby they have an ad in the paper
Yeah.
for a helper, and they sort of get some help out of them, but then butcher them for meat.
Yes. Yeah. Sounds like
You
once a
sort of
month or whatever.
suspect
Like,
that, but it becomes really clear. Yeah.
yeah, it becomes more and more clear. Um, and he does. He sort of joins and starts becoming the handyman, doesn't he? Sort of around the house and stuff. That's when you are sort of introduced to the different tenants and their relationship to the butcher and to each other, and how there's a hierarchy in the building, and the higher up you go, the richer they are, um, and that sort of thing. And you start to meet some of the relationships between some of them as well. So, for example, like the butcher is sleeping with one of these the female tenants, because that's how she gets the meat or whatever. And then he has this daughter, Julie, and there's a family with a mother-in-law. There's just like these odd characters all throughout the building. There's another couple, and then there's a guy that lives in the basement that cultivates snails and frogs. We'll get to him. He's amazing. Um,
Yeah, these characters are great. I
yeah,
mean, I think they're sort of better talking about them now and in recollection than they are at the time, where some of it's just sort of weird and it just is what it is. But they're all charming, and they all have sort of gags associated with them that
mm,
are pretty subtle. Like you see this old couple, and they've got a bunch of kids, and they're repairing this condom. That they reuse the same condom after sex and they patch it.
yeah.
There's a bunch of gags like that.
Well, this is the thing. I think this is one of those films that, like, despite the sort of the flaws at the end, I think would benefit from repeat viewing, where you'll get to see it's layered. Like this film, we said this about with the Mad Max film. Like there's stuff going on. Like this is one of the most designed and sort of like set up sets you'll ever see. Like it's wonderfully well done, where you'll see things in the background and things are going on. Um, One of my favorite gags. That's quite. I mean, this is dark as well. This film is, like you see, it's a dark
Yeah.
comedy. Like it's dark. The two tenants at the top of the building is a rich couple who, one of them walks around like, in a smoking jacket, and he's very sort of like, suave, and his wife, beautifully done up and stuff, but she clearly wants to kill herself because the voices in her head. So the film follows her repeatedly trying to kill herself in different sort of ways, sort of like in sort of like Acme
Rube Goldberg
Rube
kind of
Goldberg kind
devices.
of way. Yeah.
Well, what's interesting is they're all designed to have somebody else trigger the device,
Yes.
right? Which is sort of like, I found myself thinking like it's kind of an out for her, but it's also like imposing this tremendous guilt on somebody,
Well,
whoever is like ringing the doorbell.
yes. Well, I love yeah. There's so many that they start escalating. Like at one point, she's like, because we also find out, so by the way, the voices that are talking to her are one of the other tenants as well in the building. So she's not mad, but
Who's trying to seduce her.
yes.
Very French, right? All's fair in love and war.
Oh, like
Uh,
yeah, the ultimate negging in basically sort of like he's gaslighting it into thinking she's insane. But like she starts by trying to electrocute herself in the bathtub,
bathtub.
but then the electric goes, and then that doesn't work. And then also the end of the film is her. She tries to drop a sew machine on her head from a distance, and has a candle floating in water as the sink fills up, the candle gets closer to the thing, and then there's a shotgun attached to. But the end one is my favorite because it's like multiple. Like she has a shotgun attached to the door. The gas is on, and then something's going to set fire to the thing. She's taking a bunch of pills, and she's trying to hang herself all in one go. And then when it goes wrong, it's like the reverse of Final Destination. Like everything resolves itself so that she can't kill herself. Like the water sort of,
Mm-hmm.
the rope snaps, the gun breaks, all these other stuff. So I like this as a running gag of how dark and kind of like weirdly twisted it is. Um, but the point is, which I think we should get to, it's all the side things I like about this film. The main crux of it, as it appears, is not the best part of the film.
You mean with like the troglodytes or with the
Yes.
new? Lieutenant
Well, the
with
new guy,
Louison and his
Louis on coming in and being a sort of like a viewpoint character to take us through like this safari through these weird characters and stuff is brilliant. Like I like all that. Like even he sort of fits in. You find out he's a clown and
Mhm.
he has this sad backstory. It was him. He had this chimpanzee called Livingston that was attacked and eaten after a performance,
Mhm.
and you're just like, that's crazy. He refers to it as a carcass. Like he literally does the description at one point. He says, "Oh, we found the carcass," and it kind of freaks out Julian. She's like, "Well, they ate him basically,"
Mhm.
and so I like his maneuvering around the building. As he sort of meets people. There's a wonderful. I mean, again, like just the visuals in this, like all this. If I was just watching an hour of this, of them just meeting the people within the building, I'd be happy and be like, "Cool, I'm done. I'm out." Like there's a scene when he has to go into is it Madame Plessy? Plus the I'm gonna struggle with this, but the woman who's been sleeping with the butcher,
Plus.
Plus, and he goes in because her bed's squeaking, and then she says, "Oh, it only
Mm.
squeaks when there's two of us on it." So they sit there, and there's almost like a choreographed, like synchronized performance of like them as they sort of, they're sort of looking at the squeaking, and there's some music on, and then they lean back to find it, and it's just so well done. And there's like a
Yeah,
montage.
this director has done other stuff like that. I mean, that stuff is an anomaly. I mean,
Yeah,
the orgasm thing with like the couple having
everybody,
sex and
yeah,
everybody in the and you think,
beating to
oh,
the
I've
same
done
rhythm.
that.
Yeah,
Right, I mean, we've all done that where there's a song on or something, and we
yeah,
start moving to, and then we sort of think, I don't need to keep accelerating just
yeah.
because the songs accelerate. But they're sort of tiring themselves out. I mean, there are a lot of the sort of rhythm gags, and that stuff is like I really appreciate it partially because it's hard to script.
Mm,
Like that's stuff that you can't. It's not just a writer scripts it and then a director shoots it. That's stuff that is much more organic,
mm,
and as a result, you rarely see them due to the vagaries of film production. Um, but then there's also like even then there's this layering where there's the TV is on. That's where they're getting this song. And the TV, is on again at the end, and it's playing him with Livingston, an old broadcast, which is sort of charming that that's happening during this
mm,
climax, and I love this sort of layering cut to the TV image and all of that. But during that bed scene, it's a old Hawaiian dance on the TV,
yes,
uh, which is quite charming, not only because I love any representation of Hawaii, but also, this image of a better place, a better life that, they can only imagine in this
yeah.
post-apocalyptic world.
Yeah, but this is the thing, like you said, there's an organicness to this. It feels like, especially because this is a set. I mean, this is the kind of thing that would probably like CG now, but this is a set. It feels tangible, and yeah, they do sort of like there's gags throughout it when you sort of feel like they've gone, oh, that would be cool, right? I've got this shot. Let's try this. I mean, there's at one point they have Lewis on painting the ceiling by the stairs, and he becomes part of the rhythm
Mhm.
whilst the butcher's having sex with Madame Pulsey. And it's one of these things where like he puts his suspenders attached to something, so he's like painting the ceiling whilst he's bouncing backwards and forwards and stuff. And there's a lot of really well shot sight gags that I appreciate. So I was like, oh, this I'm enjoying this. This is good. This is I don't want to say like it feels like cinema, but it felt like thought had gone into this. Do you know what I mean? Where it's like,
Yeah.
we've got this set. This is how I'm structuring the shot for this purpose, and this is the gag, or this is the shot, or this is the point of this thing. Like everything feels like it has it. Like it feels manufactured, but like purposefully manufactured. Do you know what I mean? Like it feels that that uncanniness comes because it feels um sort of organic but staged at the same time.
I know what you mean. I mean, I think for me, it sort of feels like, why have I not seen this earlier?
Mm,
Why have I not seen this in more films? This seems like, I mean, in some ways it goes back to Chaplin and sort of earlier films. Um, but again, I think it's sort of because of the usual divide between, writer, director,
Mm.
actors. We're used to this production. It's similar in comics where sometimes, you have a writer, you have an artist, you have a colorist, and then sometimes you get somebody who's just doing all of it, and they do some sort of like weird combinations, and they do things that only somebody really in charge of all of those things would do themselves. Um, and so it feels very organic. It feels very like the best of French cinema, where it sort of feels like, oh, this is so obvious. This is such a clever little bit. Why have I not seen this in every movie? I can only justify it based on, the divided labor.
Yeah, I think this comes to this. We've touched on this before, but I don't know as far as auteur, because I'm not sure how I feel about that as a phrase. But it's a vision. Like, this is a vision that um uh the director's having. Like, this is how he feels that this is being presented. So yeah, Jean-Pierre Julian is saying like, oh, this is how this looks. This is my vision. This is the how this world is presented. And again, like you say, very quickly, like Wes Anderson is, certain Wes Anderson. I think like um the Grand Budapest Hotel was probably my closest kind of. It's the one I haven't seen a whole load of Wes Anderson, but like that style, which I think he sort of really truly formed like the Royal Tenenbaums, and then sort of goes from there.
Mhm.
But also, it made me think of um, Edward Scissorhands, Tim
Mm,
Burton's Edward Scissorhands, and that idea of how they have that sort of like manufactured urban
mm,
estate in that. Like, you have like, the contrast between the um, sort of kind of bedraggled and gothic Edward versus this sort of pastel vision of urbanity, the urbane sort of society,
Suburbia.
suburban. So
Yeah.
yeah, but this felt in that sort of mold where it's like, oh no, I have a vision, and it's going to be. This is the kind of thing now. You said you don't see this very often, or this thing, and I think there's a reason for that. This is when you see this in films now, when someone is telling a story. Okay, so you'll have a film grounded in a emotionally like a reality, and they'll be like, oh, well, here's the history of how this happened, or here's this fairy tale that's connecting us to the story, and you get this kind of
Mm.
um
Little
uncanny.
flashback or side story.
Yes, and that's when there's someone will go, oh, we can use this cool weird technique of sort of like comfortable uncanny to differentiate it from the reality. But in this case, they're like, no, this is the reality. It's weird, and we're going to live in it for an hour and a half. Um, and I'm cool with that. Like, I enjoy it. I think it's an interesting place to visit.
Yeah, and I think that so much of what works about this film is just that cast and just the
Mm,
that set of characters. And it's funny. I mean, it's a post-apocalyptic movie, but you could sort of almost forget that.
yeah.
Um, I think about like there's a Spanish film. Uh, is it Spanish or French? L'Auberge Espagnole, which is like the Spanish hostel, and it's
Mm,
basically about like a young man who I think it's a Frenchman who goes to Spain, and he, it's like all of his the wacky people living in this hostel together, and it's sort of like my year abroad kind of
mm.
thing. Um, it's sort of a beloved film, but it that has much of the same thing where like what works is just that set of characters, right?
Yes.
And it's like the cannibalism and the post-apocalyptic setting almost feels like an afterthought, even though it's really
Yeah.
the core setting and the main driver of the plot.
Yeah. Well, it's almost like it's one. A lot of the things we've dealt with is how in this season has been, well, the apocalypse has impacted, massively impacted the way people are going to have to live. The apocalypse is like the center of their world. Whether it's in on the beach where everyone's had to move to Australia, and the wave of radiation's coming, or Mad Max where everyone's wearing assless chaps and riding around in scooters. Like, the apocalypse becomes sort of like the center of the world. And this is in this situation, we don't know what the apocalypse is. Like, we haven't really got a
Right.
clue. The buildings are battered, and it looks like they've been bombed. There's a kind of blitz kind of look to the thing. You don't see anything beyond this tenement building. But there are certain structures in place. Like he's referred to as the butcher, the postman's referred to as the postman, but clearly has a bit more of an authority. And these other things, and there's these underground troglodytes, and there's this whole thing around corn. Like there's this whole expanse of what's going on, but you never know anything about that really. What I like
Yeah,
is it
that's
kind of. So I was going to say it just kind of centers where the point have gone. People have gone, yeah, the apocalypse happened, but I've still got to keep living.
yeah. Well, I mean, sure. And yeah, maybe that's very French, right? Like,
Mm,
you keep doing you, but we've been doing the same thing for 1,000 years in
yeah.
these four-story Parisian apartments. Um, I was going to say it's clear that newspapers are still functioning, right? Like the Post is
Mm.
still functioning. People have food rations. These little glimmers of the world are fascinating. So they're TV broadcasts, but they're all in black and white for some reason, right? Like
Yeah.
they're
And old.
playing old footage.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what's happened there? This is just old footage they had lying around? I mean, do you not have anything more recent? I don't know what's happened there. But there's a TV station.
Mm.
There are newspapers, but the newspapers are printing propaganda, and the troglodytes are depicted as like five-story monsters,
Yeah.
that the government is
They are
fighting.
the enemy. I like that as well. They're
Yeah.
just the enemy. Yeah.
Yeah, in fact, there's a propaganda poster that you see on the wall at one point, featuring a
Mm.
troglodyte depiction, and it says like, it says like l'ennemi conspire quand il respire. It's like the enemy conspires as he breathes. Whenever he breathes. It's like this insane depiction of this completely fabricated. I mean,
Mm.
you know but people seem to believe this, but also not take it too seriously because daily life gets in the
Yeah.
way. And you kind of get the sense like, yeah, that frog man in the basement, in water, with frogs and snails, like you kind of get the sense like he was doing that beforehand. Like this
Yes.
wasn't such an adjustment for him, right? Which is this sort of love of French eccentricity.
Yeah. I like the fact that, like you say, he's because there's these two young boys that sort of like, that are linked with the couple with the condom that like go around and they're trying to steal his frogs and they get sort of caught out. They've got nets to go in. And there's a great scene when he sort of like he plucks a snail off his head and he's like, oh yeah, I'll have some of those. And there's a collection, like a growing like mountain of snail shells growing in the corner of his room. And so he's almost like apart from the cannibalism. Like he's chosen, I'm going to live here. Right, I'm at the bottom of the social order
The
in this
food
building.
chain, yeah,
Yeah,
literally and figuratively.
but I'm going to keep out of this whole cannibalism thing by eating frogs and
Well, and
snails.
in a weird way, right? Like you think like this is really disgusting. Like he lives in water. He's obviously filthy.
Mm,
He's nodding off in a chair with frogs and snails on him, and
yeah,
it's disgusting. And then you think, oh, he's not eating human flesh. He's
yeah,
eating escargot all the
yeah,
time. Like
yeah,
he's eating it like an expensive delicacy. You know, which you like or you don't. I don't, but it's not a bad life.
no,
He's got his own food source. He's got the shit figured out.
yeah, yeah. Um, but he adds to the feel and the sort of the layeredness of this building. Um, but the thing is, well, that's you say that the only external parties that we meet are the postman who turns up and is trying to seduce Julie, the butcher's daughter, and kind of well, he resorts to basically sexual assault by the end of the film. But um, I do. They call him the
It
postman,
is
but
a French movie, after all. I mean,
yes, but he clearly represents like some form of authority as well, doesn't he? Because he
mhm.
brings things, but like the newspapers, but the information it's more like information trading as well, and he knows of the cannibalism, and it's quite clear that this isn't the only place that this thing goes on. Um, so it's almost like he's a part of the system that allows this to happen and sort of ferries information around for people to keep in touch, but it's not quite. He's not this way. He's not delivering mail. Like there's more to it than that. at the end of the film, like he has a gun, he's presented in a certain way, like he feels like a
Well, and
an
he pulls the gun
authority.
when the package is stolen, right?
Yeah.
And everybody kind of respects him, and he. So you're right. He does have a sort of authority, which is out of proportion to just being a mailman,
Mm.
and that sort of makes you think that maybe he's the connective tissue connecting all of these different buildings. Um,
That's how I saw it. Yes, exactly
yeah,
that. Yeah.
he's their link to the outside world. Although
Mm.
they can go into the outside world. I mean, they're not wearing gas masks to go into the street. Uh,
No, but there's another gag. It's so foggy or smoggy because they can go out, but they don't really. That his motorbike has a series of pans and pots and stuff attached to the back of it so you can hear it. And at one point, the old woman who's been knitting a lot, she attempts to go out, and the Lewison says, "Oh, should we not stop her?" Like, and they're like, "No, no, no, she's fine. She knows the way. She's blind, but we'll hear her and we'll go find her, like we've always done so." And she's got a series of like cans and pots and stuff attached to the back of her as well. So there is this idea of like they use sound to track people down as well in this fog and smog. So they can go out and about, but it's not easy to find your way. And beyond a certain
mm,
point, you could end up being picked off by another one of these tenement buildings. So you got to
right.
sort of stay close.
This is like the French version of Judge Dredd Block Wars.
Yeah,
It's like
yeah,
every 4-story building is now a little universe unto itself, a
yeah.
little
Oh, very much
society.
so.
And and the apocalypse is of course mostly used to justify the cannibalism.
Yeah,
But I do sort of like this, sort of reference to or at least it reminds me of sort of like uh, the French occupation, and there are no Nazis, but it's this sort of like everything's black market.
yeah.
Everybody's been forced to kind of do things that they don't want to do. There's not enough food to go around. I mean, this is in living memory, especially then, of
Mm-hmm.
the French and a national scar that has not healed to this day. Um, and so, I do sort of feel this sort of like there's a acceptance of the black market, an acceptance of sort of uh cannibalism, and having to do terrible things.
Yes, well, it becomes almost passe, doesn't it? It's almost like, well, that's just what we've got to do. And the butcher even says it like it's a matter of survival because
Mhm.
meat is, and this seems to be the divide truly between the the tenement owner and the butcher and stuff, and the troglodytes is the eating of meat, where we don't there's no cattle, we don't talk about sheep or pigs or anything else. It's just the only meat that's eaten is human meat, and all the troglodytes that live underground and wear unusual rubber suits are looking for corn, and corn has become
Mm.
like a traded commodity. Like there is no money, but they talk about at one point when he's selling some of the meat to his tenants is he calls it says, "Oh, two measures," and it's 2 bags of corn, or it's 1 bag of corn but 2 large bags of it. And later on we find out he's wealthy because he's got these big bags of corn in his apartment. And then we also see that the daughter Julie buys off the troglodytes by saying, "I can get you this corn." So there is this sort of thing as well of farm produce, or like being important.
One of the best gags, I'm not sure it's really a gag, is Julie has a conversation with her father, uh, where she says, like, please don't kill this one. It's clear she's kind of falling for Louison,
Mm,
who's a former clown who worked with the chimpanzee, though we don't quite know it yet, but that Livingston is a chimpanzee.
yeah,
But she has this conversation, and the butcher replies like, "You always do this," like and so
yeah,
there's this implication that sort of like she's fallen in love with him, probably had an affair with everybody who's responded to this ad and wanted to save them, and um which I think is quite funny. You know,
yeah,
which also seems very French. Like it undermines, like I think for a British American audience, like that undermines the love story that she's fallen in love lots of times, and this is just her personality. but to a French mentality, it's like, no, that's the way it is. That does not
Yeah.
undermine anything at all, right? That's
each
her charm.
That's it. Each cycle of romance is just as valid as the last one.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, no, it's true. It's interesting how, like you say, they almost try and present. I don't know. Actually, it's interesting because each of the characters, the butcher is the, let's say, the primary villain of the piece. Like he's the landlord. He's running the place. He's the butcher. He has the primary contact with the postman. Like he's again this sort of figure of authority
I mean,
within this
he is a
building.
mass murderer,
Yeah, well,
technically.
yeah, exactly, yeah. And also he manipulates people like repeatedly to sort of like to get what he wants of his tenants. I mean, at one point he's gonna kill like the mother-in-law of one of them,
Mhm.
or one of the other women, and then so one of the men sacrifices their leg in order the bottom half of their leg so that some of the tenants can have meat, and it sort of like puts off this other killing just in case. Um,
It's a dark comedy.
Oh yeah, no, it's fun and it is. It's well done, but it's these sort of like. But what's interesting is like it's a dark comedy but like no one is apart from the butcher. No one's like truly villainous in that sense, and I kind of like that. Even like like you said, like Julie, she's been there. She's a part of the system. Like she knows this is going on. She's not innocent of the acts that have gone on before. Like whether or not she's actively eating some of the meat, we don't really know. It's never really stated.
And she reaps the benefits. I mean, she's got a nice upstairs apartment.
Yeah,
Everybody knows that she is the daughter of the butcher, so nobody really screws with her.
yeah,
You know, she has status because of what daddy's mass killing and
yeah,
manipulating
exactly.
of people.
And then the same with this, like you see the rich couple are sort of like, they've got the wealth at the top, but like they're kind of depressed and twisted as well and stuck in this situation just the same as everybody else is. And it goes down the chain. So, but they're the only, there's a few characters. I mean, there's the two people that make the cow noise things as well. And
Mm.
then there's a part where do they go? Do they trade those? Do people buy those? Is it just something they do to pass the time? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. They make those sort of like round
Moo,
objects,
moo.
and
You turn it upside down, yeah. Um,
and they like they're huffing glue,
yeah,
basically. Like, yeah.
yeah, yeah. Um, but again, like you sort of learn that each of the characters is doing something to somebody else. Like, they're either sort of like, and the husband of who's with making these things, sort of like, he's clearly he enjoys eating this meat, and he says at one point, like, I have a hole in me, I have a hole, I have a gap in me, a hole in me. I need meat. Um, so they are kind of like they've been twisted by this experience. They're sort of their callousness towards this activity is on a show, but they're still like human in this way. So it's kind of I enjoy meeting the characters, but you're also like, yeah, they're kind of messed up and weird and twisted and stuff as well. I wouldn't want to meet them, but I'm kind of glad I'm getting to see them, if you know what I mean.
I do. Like I mean, they're quirky, they're interesting, but you don't really hate them. I mean, even the
No.
butcher I don't hate. I mean, the butcher actually has that speech where he says, like, I'm getting tired of this, I don't
Mm.
know that my heart's in it anymore. Um, and it's interesting, especially comparing this to other apocalyptic movies that, you think of the Mad Max movies and so many others where there's this emphasis laid on the psychological damage of living in the apocalypse, right? I mean,
Mm.
we're gonna wind up at the road, right? Like,
Yeah.
I mean, but with Mad Max, I mean, it's like that's kind of the narrative justification for everything is, like everybody's gone crazy. I mean, this has
Mm.
broken everybody, and not just civilization, but every individual psyche. And here it's sort of like, I don't know if it's broken them or just exaggerated their normal eccentricities.
Yeah, I mean that's a really good point. I think, there's time to fill, and given time to fill, people's eccentricities or sort of like, madnesses sort of take hold, don't they? That's the thing. It's sort of, if you haven't got the distractions, and you've also got to try and, ignore or justify the crimes that you are sort of complicit in. It does feel a little bit like that. Like there's a kind of like the making of those mooing things is very much a sort of like, well, we've got time to. I don't know if they trade them. They don't seem to do anything with them. Like we'll just moo. The kids are running around the building trying to they're sort of part, not really part of the whole thing, but they're trying to steal underwear and do other things. Like there is kind of like a need to fill the time so that you know the isolation doesn't kind of drive them mad.
That's a good point. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. There's kind of the implication is that they're stuck in this building and they've
Mm.
all kind of slightly gotten mad.
Yeah. I think they're trapped with each other. I mean, it's presented almost like as a microcosm, as it's a microcosm of sort of class structures society. And I think it sort of, to me, it sort of highlights, yeah, we're kind of stuck with each other. Whether it be in a 4-story tenement building in post-apocalyptic France or in the wider perspective. But in this situation, like, the upper class at the very top of the building don't really want to have to deal with those lower classes, but they
Well, it's
kind of do.
interesting. The class thing is interesting because there is this obviously upstairs, downstairs sort of thing going on, as you say. At the same time, like even upstairs is not great.
No.
And, I mean, Julie says so explicitly. But I mean, like, if the butcher is the top of this food chain, I mean, that's a working class job, right? And he's good at his job. He's also a landlord, but this is an old building. You get the sense that this was an old building before the apocalypse, and they're sort of okay, but I mean, this is not a, fancy, first arrondissement sort of place, right?
Yeah, this isn't like a ritzy hotel that they've rocked up in and are now sort of like, living in. No, this is I get the feeling, and I do, you fill these things in my own head, that whatever happened, the rich couple at the top came after and were like, we're hiding out here, and end up getting stuck there with whatever it is they had in tow. But there is a statement at one point where the butcher's talking to the guy with the family, and he says about the guy says, I need the meat. And he says, well, we're all in the same situation, whatever. The guys upstairs.
We're all hungry.
We're all hungry upstairs and at each level, whatever. And he says something about the people in the top apartment. And he just says, well, it's all right. It's always all right for the wealthy. So there is this idea of sort of they are at the top of the food chain, it's all right but you never know what defines that wealth.
Yeah.
Because what we find, is clear is they're almost like the English aristocracy, like, they're the landed gentry, but cash poor. They're sort of like, they're linked with the rich and being aristocracy, but actually they're not. They don't have a bean between them. The only person in this building.
You say that's a British thing, but I think that's much more a French thing. It's like every chateau has passed to another family that can afford to pay it, or there's some sort of, I mean, nobility on the continent, especially in France, does not mean money.
Exactly. Yeah. To be a lord and lady does not mean you're anymore. Does not mean you're sort of like, a duke or an earl or whatever. Does not mean you're going around in the gold carriage. And that kind of feels a bit like what this is. These are the sort of like, they represent sort of like that gentry, but they haven't got a bean between them. Like they still have the best clothes, but it still feels worn, and they've worn them again and again. But the only person that we know is rich is the person that has the control, is the butcher, is the landlord. Like he holds the power, he has the bags of corn. So I suppose although there's this class, I suppose it's so shared that whoever's there, the class structure's there, but the power rests with those that control. Well, I suppose the corporations control the food chain, control the housing, control the water, so on and so forth. So yeah, that's where true power really sits in a modern power structure.
It's interesting.
But this sort of comes to the ending, and I want to sort of jump to the ending, as in stick on this point, not to go through all the farcical stuff.
Right.
We'll get to that shortly. But the finale of the film, the very end point of this film, the succession of the film is that the butcher is killed. And so he is taken out. And then it sort of cuts to the two lads playing on the roof, and then we have Julie and Louison playing instruments and that on the roof. And there's this kind of like fairy tale ending of like they were all, lived happily ever after.
And the sky clears up.
And the sky's starting to clear and whatever, but like, which is nice, very fairy tale. But it does sort of it got to me that I was like, cool. What happened to the power structure of this building? Like, did she inherit it? Has she now taken on the role of the butcher, or have they now cleaned this thing up? And now the corn's being distributed amongst the tenants of the building, and the troglodytes are now involved. Like, I don't know. It felt a bit like,
Yeah, I don't think anything's changed. I mean,
yeah,
but it is, I had the same thought, because that rich couple has blown themselves up, right? So they're
yes,
not around. And obviously the building has been gutted by a fire and a flood.
yeah,
I don't see that being repaired anytime soon. I mean, maybe Louison will continue his work, but no, I sort of had the same thought. And she hated her father, but she's not really a revolutionary. I
no,
mean, sort of like the troglodytes are the French Revolution, right? They're
mm.
the people overturning cars in the streets, every time the wind blows, in France. Um, but she's not really a revolutionary. There's nobody is a revolutionary. I mean, the troglodytes are barely a revolution. But yeah, I don't know how that's reconstituted, and it does feel sort of quickly done, right? I
yes,
mean, it's amusing, right? But the point is the love and the music, right? I mean, this is a movie that is way more interested in uh, the cello and the musical saw than it
yeah,
is in some of the basic functions of plot and
yeah,
setting.
yes. No, I agree. That's true. That's very, very true, and that's nice. And I think it
Hmm.
works in that sense. Um, but I do, and again, I'm fine with that. Like, this isn't about the resolution. This isn't about that sort of like doing what as you say, sort of that prologue or the epilogue, sort of saying like this is what's happened. Like, it's not about that. That's almost irrelevant, especially this fairy tale. Beyond they lived happily ever after. But what I find is that the as you say, sort of like this film is presenting something. It is the thing is what's the reason I get frustrated, but it's because it is presenting something. Like, it is saying that there's a social order in this building, there's a political order in a wider structure. So it kind of needs to sort of give me at least something to say this is, it could have just panned down and showed the buildings and showed everybody in them or
Mm-hmm.
something, a bit like, you know, um, I don't know. But the other thing that's interesting, that again, another director that came to mind while watching this, and especially the moment we were introduced to the troglodytes, was
Mm.
Terry Gilliam.
I knew you were going to go there. Yeah.
Because as you call like the French Revolution, they're actually sort of like they are the enemy, or they're this thing, this monster that is sort of like held up as being, this thing to be sort of avoided or to be feared. And then when you meet them, they're kind of incompetent and comedic and silly. And again, it felt like, this idea of just everyone's kind of incompetent and silly at what they do. And they barely have a purpose. Like, their sort of like um agenda is never sort of laid out. Like, what is it they're fighting for or against? Just kind of feels like they're surviving in a different way, and they're just
Mm-hmm.
like a gang of like idiot blokes trying to do their thing. Like, they break in and they do like a little high five dance when they find out the corn's all good. Like, it's
That stuff is very silly, and
yes,
and I don't know sort of how to take that. They do this sort of like silly little song and rub elbows, sort of almost Rocky Horror
hmm
style. Um, I'm not really sure how we're supposed to take it, except just as a comedic sort of weird. It's just another weird thing they do. Um, but yeah, I mean, it seems like they're just surviving and they're underground and they basically just raid the surface and steal stuff.
mm.
They don't seem to really have a lot of revolutionary zeal.
No. Well,
Yeah, they're not Che Guevara.
no. Well, that's what I mean. They don't sort of have like an agenda. They're not like there's no like
Mhm.
revolution of like, they refer to the people as sort of like the I don't know, the surface dwellers, and they're the underground. It's sort of like there's less of a revolution. They've sort of kind of just accepted this difference between them, but they just don't want to mix with the above. However, they kidnap Madame Pulse or whatever her name is, and they actually sort of like one of them becomes very attracted to her and kisses her, and then sort of says, just in case I don't make it back. So there is this weird, I don't know, it kind of feels like they want to be shown that, they want to, I don't know, there's not heroic, because they're off to kidnap Louison to protect him. It's kind of what it's there for. But so are they mercenary? Are they can be bought off, and they have the phone connection and stuff, the radio connection. I don't know what purpose they serve in the wider kind of world. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think a few things are interesting. I sort of get the impression that they just have a different solution to the problem. So, if there's fog and there's, fallout or whatever it is, and there's food shortages, their solution is, right, well, let's go underground. We can live in sewers and, we can live underground. And that just seems like a different solution, and they have a different society. And so, they're kind of like raiding the surface, but they're not a threat, as you say. I mean, this is not like Thundar the Barbarian or something, underground mole men. They're just guys in wetsuits, with mining lights on their heads. And yeah, they don't seem very threatening. I think the other thing that's really interesting is how easily Julie finds them. She's like, oh, I've heard about them. I'm gonna contact them to try to save Louison, to reach out to somebody, and she just goes into the sewer and finds them. And so you have to conclude, like, the government is not only spreading propaganda, but basically is non-functional. Like, it is not capable of mounting a defense. It is, it's not bothering to send guys with guns into the sewers. It's barely able to print a newspaper claiming that they've gunned somebody down and gunned down a monster.
Yes. Because they are portrayed. Well, it's almost like they think that's going to be enough. If we can scare the populace, keep them in fear of these things, that they will keep their distance, or knowing that these people kill and eat each other, will probably attack and keep these things under control as it is. I mean, yeah, it's like you said, there's not roving bands of sort of like surface dwellers going after them, is it? There's not like an organized militia that's taken after them. It's sort of like there is kind of a laissez-faire attitude to this sort of society, where the sort of the government's almost like, we'll distribute this enough information to keep people worried and concerned about these things, but we're not going to deal with it because it's not really a problem, but it keeps control of these little isolated blocks of people. And again, I'm just filling in the gaps.
Yeah, it's a very unique apocalypse, right? It's like the apocalypse happens, the government collapses. There are certain implications of that, in terms of food, in terms of propaganda. But, in a lot of ways, life just continues. It's just that we start cannibalizing each other. But, like you say, when you say there's no roving bands, I mean, this is not A Boy and His Dog, This is not Mad Max, there's not a lot of sort of violence. The violence that you see is just butchering people for food. And there's no real joy taken in it. It's just a matter of fact, like, in order to eat our charcuterie with our crackers, then cheese, this is what we have to do.
Yeah. For life to continue as we appreciate it, then this is the things we are doing. I think this attitude is interesting because, as well, it is also shown in their response to Louison. Because Louison, when they know him as the handyman, is kind of looked down upon. He's sort of like, he meets each of them and he's kind of built a relationship with them, but he's kind of seen as a bit. They know he's heading for the butcher's block. Let's put it that way. That's the intention. Then we find out that he's this clown that sort of performed with Livingston, the chimpanzee, and he has this sad backstory. And then, but But then it's kind of the other people are informed about it and get to know about it, and we learn about he's doing these different gags, and some of the quite the one where Julie walks in and it's his head on a table with a cleaver in his head. Um, very well placed, very well done. But the moment they identify him as a celebrity, like, oh, I've performed with things and now I'm going to be on television, it almost takes him off the butcher's block because it elevates his status as well. When they're like, oh, you're going to be on television, you're a celebrity. Oh, we're going to see this. And several people sort of start acting, that he is. It kind of splits them a little bit because then others are a bit more like, oh no, he's famous, he's a celebrity. Like we have to look at him. Others are still like, I want to eat him. But it was interesting to see the more that they got to know about him as being this clown performer that it elevated his status in this society as well.
Yeah, and I one question I have is sort of it's just something that bothers me about this film is sort of how I'm always irritated when like the hero enters the picture and he's the one person who escapes the impossible trap, right? And in a way you could justify it. It's like this is the final person to answer the sad of the butcher, right? But maybe that's because he's a celebrity and that that effect you're talking about made all the difference. But it is something that I sometimes I'm annoyed by, where I sort of want to see. I guess we do see a brief example of the beginning of somebody who doesn't escape.
Yes.
But I sort of wonder if that would be more interesting than seeing your hero escape and having a nice happy ending.
The someone who actually does end up on the butcher's block. An entire well, that'd be a darker film, wouldn't it? The one that tries to get away and doesn't. Like, yeah, you want to see the full story of the guy from the beginning of the film and how he ends up hiding himself in a dustbin and what part Julie played in that.
Or I want to see or I want to see Louison die.
Mm.
And it's still a comedy, but it's a lot darker.
Yeah. Well, at its heart, it's still a fairy tale, isn't it? This is very much a sort of a dark fairy tale. But the prince and princess or the protagonists are going to win at the end of the day. There's going to be a happy ever after, but it's kind of dark how you get there. But I know what you're saying. Like, it would be more interesting if, I mean, the gag at the end would be that Louison ends up on the butcher's block after everything that happens. Another guy then appears to become the handyman, and Julie looks at him
falls in love with him.
Yeah, exactly. Looks at him with doleful eyes, and the butcher's like, "Here we go again, around the cycle again." Just to show that that there is that sort of cyclical nature. So, yeah, I agree. That would be quite interesting. Much darker, but
very different movie.
but would feel, I don't know, but it would feel of a piece, wouldn't it? It would feel sort of like more. I suppose that maybe it would feel more authentic to the film that you start with.
Yeah, no, that's what I feel. It's sort of like, well, if Julie's fallen in love with these other types, and I love that idea, why has she not gone to the troglodytes before? Is it just that this is such a special connection?
This is true love.
I mean, I guess,
that's what this is
because
true.
he's famous and he plays a musical saw.
That's it. Yeah, his ability to play the saw is a winner. One thing I would I was going to note about as a wider piece around this sort of aesthetic. We've talked about the uncomfortable, uncanny, but one of the things that this film does is sort of the use of the close up and the sort of like everything feels very in close. The sense this building is made to feel very tight and claustrophobic, and I think the shooting of this, the shots are very good at making it like close up of faces. Like there's lots of close ups of like the shot is just somebody's face, very often expressive or like caught in the act or looking or doing something, a lot of that. And then when it's sort of like two people in the room, there's not really a wide shot unless it really needs to be a wide shot. Again, it's just almost like a mid shot of just those two people in a room. Like it's constantly sort of keeping people encased in it. So I love that. That was the first thing. The other thing is this we've talked about this sort of this artifice, this artificial. I don't say artificial reality because that's obviously a thing, but this sort of the artificiality of these realities. It, it it's only just sort of dawned on me as I'm sort of like thinking about it. So I've looked the sort of images up a bit next to me, and I'm looking at it. We've mentioned Wes Anderson, and we mentioned sort of like Tim Burton's with Edward Scissorhands and Terry Gilliam. But one thing is, this definitely became like an aesthetic, like of the 90s. It felt like this was of a time where I'm thinking this idea of this artificial reality sort of like was like Tim Burton's Batman addressed sort of like, well, how do you make Batman relevant? Well, you just don't make him modern. You keep him in this sort of artificial mid-war period. So you can have like cool looking 30s cars, but you can also have this industrial gothic look. And then even like The Crow, I forget, who also did the film that escapes me right now, um, with Kiefer Sutherland and Rufus Sewell and those others from the late 90s, that again had that sort of like dark artificial reality kind of aesthetic, where everything is
Dark City.
Dark City, thank you. Where like everything sort of is there, like it's a building and it's a road and it's a pavement and there's a car and there's people and they're dressed, but like it's not, like it's not a city and it's not a building, a city or a road or a car or a house that you would see in the real world. And so there's that sort of artificiality that definitely became like an aesthetic of the 90s as a choice. And I like it. I kind of like it. And it's used incredibly well here to sort of feel that fairy tale. And I just wonder it's a shame it's not used very much anymore. There was a show done for Netflix, a series of unfortunate Lemony Snicket's a series of unfortunate events. And the show, not the film, not the Jim Carrey film, but the actual show that was utilized exactly the same technique, and I loved it. It was phenomenally well done. And I don't know, it's just an asset. I wish it was used more for certain types of film.
Well, I think that, the 90s was a period where you could have that individual aesthetic, right? Where a director was allowed to sort of do that, and that was suddenly valued. And it's interesting to think about because here you have sort of like the cartoonishness of the sort of knife boomerang thing, the Australian,
Yeah.
And things like this these plot devices. I mean, the same thing with like the stairs. There's the bad step that's going to be important later, and there's things like this that are very sort of cartoonish. They almost belong in sort of slapstick comedy or something. But the director sort of allowed to do this, and I do think that maybe it's because budgets got so big, or just there was a change in the 2000s. I mean, I guess really like sort of The Matrix is kind of like the tail end of that, where it has its own aesthetic, but it's sort of a leather fascist sort of aesthetic, or BDSM aesthetic or something. And then going into the 2000s, you kind of have the rise of the superhero films, and everything starts to look sort of CGI, right? Everything starts to look
a plasticky
the
sheen to it.
Yeah, everything's got to be pretty, but kind of in this plastic sort of way, and this kind of tact. I think that might be part of why Wes Anderson is able to, or even like an Aronofsky, like is able to stand out more, because everything kind of looks the same. Directors aren't supposed to bring these unique visions, and you see it in the 90s with like music bifurcates. I mean, just goes, becomes very diverse. Cinema becomes very diverse. I mean, there is this kind of weird branching of everything in the 90s, but then in the 2000s it all starts shutting down.
Yeah, it is weird. Like like you said, that tail end. I mean, Amelie was a massive success. I remember that being like an international success. So, and that is less. It's less weird than Delicatessen, and it's kind of, I think it's a nicer film, but
Mhm.
um, that definitely had that same feel.
It's a
But you're right,
happier film.
it's a happy film. Yeah, it's definitely a happy film. But you're right, it feels like the tail end. It's almost like it reached a success and then sort of petered out because it was like, oh, we've kind of done it. And Wes Anderson is sort of like has continued to do it, and if anything, has perfected it more. I haven't watched a great deal of his films. Maybe I should. But even like he entered it into animation with Fantastic Mr. Fox, which is I have seen that, and I think that's very good. So yeah, I don't know. It's but this aesthetic is I wish there was more of it. But I also wish that directors were able to do more of that kind of not
Mhm.
just I'm going to tell a story differently, but like visually, I'm going to do something unusual with it.
Well, and I think there was a hunger for something different. I
Yeah.
mean, and I think that it really, when I think about the last burst of that, it really is kind of like 99 with like, you
Mm,
have like Magnolia, you have Fight Club. I mean,
mm,
these are things that the buzz was, you've got to see this movie.
mm.
This is, like Fight Club is weird. I mean, everybody talks about its macho stuff now, but it was weird. I mean, literally, the cinema comes off the projector in the middle of the movie. I mean,
Yeah.
that's how weird and experimental that movie is.
Mm,
It doesn't get credit for it, and it has a weird aesthetic too. That abandoned house, and
mm.
the camera rotating around and stuff. Sort of, And the Matrix is the same way. I mean, Magnolia is very weird and different and not controlled, and you know that was really the
Even
last moment.
even like Eyes Wide Shut does a
Yeah.
lot of this, where it used sort of like back projection to make certain scenes feel off kilter to the people that were in the dial, that were projecting in front of it. So, yeah, it felt like there was a more experimentation. You're right. Yeah, 99 was around that sort of the last
I guess like
time.
Eternal Sunshine is a little later.
Mm,
That kind of has some of that. And there are a few directors who kind of continue it a bit, but yeah, there does seem to have been more freedom for this in the 90s. And while I think, what's interesting is that's a freedom that responds well to international cinema, right?
mm,
So, I mean, you're talking about like, Dark City. I mean, that's German Expressionism, right?
mm.
I mean, the German Expressionism of first designs for Batman, right? That,
Mm.
sort of those that sort of gothic
Yeah.
look. Um, there's a kind of internationalism, and the French love that stuff, right?
Yeah.
Like the French never
Yeah.
got it. The French do not do the plastic, right? Um, that's just not something that they value, right?
Mm.
The French have much more of a I want a director to have a unique vision kind of thing. And
Yeah.
if it doesn't make sense, it's allowed not to make sense almost too much.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
Well,
so it's interesting.
no, I mean, today I would say, and again, looking at other younger generations coming through, and I'm not to put it on younger generations, but like I think that you say this hunger for something that looks different and this freedom, I think, is actually sort of captured more in like anime. The different animation styles that are used for anime. So I know that like there is a sort of like Studio Ghibli style that has been mimicked by certain things, but then you get sort of like I forget this. It's called like JoJo's Adventures, which is sort of like
JoJo's
insanely
Bizarre Adventure.
yeah, exactly
Yeah.
like JoJo's Bizarre Adventures, and then they're all animating these and then One Piece is again completely different again, and they're given this visual language and style that like I can see that is appreciated by the people that are enjoying these things that doesn't get replicated in mainstream cinema, which I think is a shame. It's good to see that it's been explored, and if the Japanese are willing to do it through animation and stuff, then that's cool. So, but yeah, I don't know. It just feels a bit like we should be doing more of it in other things.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like, these exceptions. I'm thinking about like, uh some of it um foreign film, right? Like,
Hmm.
Parasite comes in.
Mm-hmm.
So foreign film is kind of allowed to be a little different, and it kind of feels like a breath of fresh air. I forget, is that not Good Things? What is it? Strange Things? Not Strange Things. What is the feminist Frankenstein movie?
Oh,
Leonopolis.
yes,
Um,
I know what you mean.
and
But
he's
young
kind of
young
having
things with Emma Stone.
yeah, yeah,
Yes.
yeah. which is quite good. I
Mm.
mean, and his other films are bizarre. But he's sort of, not taken off, but sort of had a moment. So there does seem to be, a sort of countercultural movement, to embrace these things in part because the mainstream is so mainstream, right?
Yeah.
It's all it's almost
Well,
like we're back in the 80s where the mainstream is all hair bands and it all sounds the same by the
no,
late
I think you're
80s.
right because I'm also thinking about young Cronenberg, whose name escapes me.
Mm, Brandon.
Brandon, thank you. We talked about Possessor,
Hmm.
which had a similar thing, and I don't know if you've seen Infinity Pool. Um, Not an
Not yet.
exceptionally good film. I had my problems. I had problems with it, but again, it has a really cool aesthetic that in that same way, like it's presented in a sort of like it's reality but off kilter. Um, so you're
Poor
right.
Things was
Poor
what I was
things.
thinking.
Thank you. Yeah. Um, so yeah, I think you're right. I think there is definitely this sort of like, there's the mainstream, the multi-billion-dollar industry that is,
Yeah.
the superhero industry and all these other mainstream sort of like films, which again, I'm not going to lie, I watch and that sort of thing, but there is this underbelly of films that are definitely still doing this. You're right, and they need to be sort of, maybe they're appreciated. We have Tim Burton returning to Beetlejuice, and
Hmm.
sometimes it takes a weird kind of success. It may not be the best film. I haven't seen it yet. I'm looking forward to seeing Beetlejuice, but like it may be they go, that made $900 million. Like I doubt it will, but they could make a big success, and people are like, oh, we can do this again, and it can be a success, and hopefully, you might see these films get backed more. So I think it'll be interesting to see because you're right. I think people are kind of done with the Marvel house style of filmmaking right now.
Well, you say this, but they still make money, right? I mean,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
when you think about like, everybody likes to pronounce the death of Marvel and death of, the sort
Mm,
of like big budget franchise movies and stuff. But the truth is, when you point to something, like the Marvels or whatever, you know, there are counterexamples, right? I mean, there's, Guardians Volume 3, there's,
mm.
Wolverine Deadpool. I mean, there's, tons of counterexamples, and, a few flops does not destroy the
No.
franchise. I mean, I'd say like the real hope is stuff like Villeneuve, right? It's stuff
Oh
like,
yeah.
Dune. I mean, it's like, which is allowed to be weird, like, yeah, for as much as I gave it the sort of lukewarm review, it is amazing to see something that weird and different succeeding at that level. Um, because it does seem generally like nothing can have that amount of success. And the truth is maybe it shouldn't. I mean, Delicatessen was made for a small budget, and it's not like Delicatessen made, $300 million internationally or something, Um, it helped launch, a couple careers, but I mean, um, maybe these small films, don't have to be those big hits, but um, there should be room for them. And it seems like there was more room in the 90s, and
Yeah.
that this is kind of like riding that wave.
Yes. No, that's true. That's true. And maybe you're right. Maybe you don't want it to be mainstream because once it gets mainstream, they get sort of more cautious and things around it. Um, one.
Then you get Alien Resurrection.
Well, that was actually my. I was just going to bring that sort of as a bit of a final point was because he makes City of Lost Children
Right.
next, but then he makes Alien Resurrection, and it does feel kind of a weird transition where but the studios were like, we're ready for this guy to make our franchise film. So do you know what? Watching this, I mean, I gave my review of Alien Resurrection. It is what it is. But watching this, and then go, in sort of like having seen Resurrection first, you do kind of think that, oh, fair play to the studio actually. Like for
Hmm.
whatever came out of the back of it, whatever it was. I mean, he is not responsible for the script that brought us that sack of crap at the end of that film. That was the script demanded this weird alien baby thing. Fine. But actually, the one thing we did praise, and I did praise, was the visuals of that film.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
And it is a weird movie. I mean, like you do
yeah.
see the traces of, Now we should point out that Delicatessen was co-directed with his friend Mark Caro.
Mm.
Uh, so it's not a solo effort. But no, I'm with you. Like, I mean, it seems to me like, not to digress from Delicatessen, but it seems to me that the if there's one thing that was clear from doing the Alien franchise, right? It was that there is a series of bold choices there. I
Yes.
think that, possibly with the exception of the Alien Predator films, every Alien movie is a bold choice.
Hmm.
Um, I think even, I mean, Alien 3 going off in a different direction. I mean, it's David fucking Fincher.
Yeah.
Alien Resurrection is let's get that weird French dude who's done this, these dark, weird things to do another one. I mean, even Prometheus is like, an ambitious movie,
Mm.
whatever you think
Mm.
of it. We both kind of were pretty down on Romulus, but I mean, it looks amazing. Kudos for getting, that director. Um, but then, like, the studio, especially with Resurrection, really interfered
Yeah.
and interfered in terrible ways that seems to have made it a terrible movie in some ways. But what's strange is that, like, the studio kind of like makes these bets on these independent and eccentric directors, right? Who you think absolutely go with them, and then doesn't control the aspects of the script that it should control, like say knowing anything about the aliens
Yeah.
or the timeline or basic things like this. Like it clearly doesn't care about the franchise, but the studio instead cares about like hitting a list of things that it wants to hit as far as like character and plot points that some studio exec thinks will market well.
Hmm.
And so it makes sure to hit those dumb, little test market points and not hit the things that it should be trying to hit that make sense for a franchise or artistically. And the end result is sort of in some ways prefiguring the Marvel movies of sort of these, I think about the Marvel movies and how miserable it must be directing those movies. And I think about, like Tim Burton almost quitting movies after directing Dumbo for Disney,
Hmm.
like it must be such a miserable experience making these expensive corporate movies,
Well,
you know.
I think one of the things that's been reported, I think that's why Disney Marvel is now having a bit of a problem sort of getting new up and coming directors on, because I think like Nia DaCosta in particular came out from like the Marvels. I think somebody else came out as well and said the exact same thing. They basically were like, you get to direct these bits, we'll handle these other bits. So anything that's action, anything that's this, anything that's that, like, that's us. You get to do the drama and you can put your stamp on that kind of, but you don't get to do the visuals, you don't get to do this, you don't get to do that. So there's a lot of like, exactly this sort of like, it's more about saying, look at the new, shiny, diverse directors we're bringing in, but they've still got to fit into the Marvel machine and they get to direct 40% of the film. So, you know, they're there for the other 60, but they're kind of not really in charge, because that's the bits that are important for connectivity or for the CGI or the, that kind of thing. So, yeah, I can
Or
imagine it's
hitting
blood.
the Disney test marketed points.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And I can imagine it being bloody awful, to be perfectly honest. It sounds like, so that's when you watch films like this and you're like, oh, this is a vision of either one or two people coming together to do stuff. Like, cool. Like, no matter how much it sort of falls apart in the third act of to try and bring down Louison or save Louison or whatever, at least it's like someone's vision and they went for it, and
Hmm.
they swung this, as we always say, like they swing for the fences, and I'm going to enjoy and appreciate that. So, I think I'd watch this over any number, a large number of the Marvel films again. So
Well, and if there's one thing that this movie has going for it, it is that sense of vision,
yeah.
right? It is that, it has the aesthetic, it has the weird characters, it's got, all these, sort of sight gags, like, it's just stuff that like should not be in a movie in 1991.
No,
Um,
and so many
but
things I think I missed as well, which is, as you say, I think this film it would improve, or I can imagine people getting a tech connected to or growing an affection for over repeat viewings.
Hmm. Absolutely. And there's so much focus, again, like I mentioned how like I can't imagine how some of that gets in there with a separation between a screenwriter and a director, right?
Hmm.
And what that means is also it can't be corporate engineered, right? Um, so you think about some of these things with like, just the synchronization to the TV and, stuff like that. I mean, but also how much of this is music driven, right?
Mm.
I mean, like there are whole scenes of like the sort of caps that make different tones, when they're
Yeah.
hit. I mean, there's so much emphasis on like sound and not just the cello, which and I used to play the cello. I love the cello. Um, and the musical saw. I have a friend who plays the musical saw. I mean, which is such a just weird and wonderful, and but there's so much emphasis on music and on these weird visuals, and you do get a sense of film as an audio visual medium, right? Where instead of just having like the sort of written track, right? The track of what's spoken and what the action is that's normally the, uh, domain of the screenwriter, and then you have a visual, and that's a cinematographer, and the director. I mean, here everything feels merged and organic in a way that we're not used to seeing, and that feels very much more true to cinema in a
Mm.
way. And I think that's some of what we responded to with Mad Max,
Mm.
where, Miller just has such an overriding presence on those films that, he's clearly in that editing room,
Yeah.
like he's focused on delivering an audiovisual experience. And I think that that's something, cinema is so powerful because it's able to combine audio and visual and control the pace. And yet it so rarely uses those advantages. And I think that Delicatessen, while, low budget, while, a mess in certain ways, is in love with using those advantages
Mm.
and telling the story it wants to tell. And it's charming for that thing. And
Yeah.
I'm with you. I'd rather have that than I would, another, to use the metaphor, piece of hamburger that's been heavily processed.
Yeah. No, I agree. I think, and to sort of, I'll echo that. Actually, I think one of the things that's not only I'm an IMDb, and I like to have the images next to me because it triggers thoughts and stuff in my head. And what I see is every shot of this film, is, I'm not gonna say a masterpiece, but you can see the artistry, or you can see the vision, from the lighting to the position of the camera to the props, or to the stage dressing to the, right, the placing of the people. Okay, you're going to be sort of like off center because there's a reason, because we want to see the space behind you, or we've got to show another thing behind you, like, and not just to forward the plot, just to be like, oh no, we want people to see that thing. Like, it could just be a TV set in the background, or like
Mm.
that weird flooring that exists that's kind of puts you off sort of kilter, or there's something else, or
Yeah. I love that flooring. That that sort of like 3D cube
yeah,
design,
amazing.
and the shot of the so while we'll talk about the climax, but as the troglodytes are invading, the crazy woman who's being gaslit,
Sees the
empties
face.
the dustbin and sees
Yeah.
into a face of somebody other. And it, again, it's a simple thing, but you love the texture of
Mm.
like, yeah, I love the texture of that design of that refuge chute, and that the shot of the guy's face. Um, there's another shot of a troglodyte who is hanging upside down, and his face appears enormous because it's in the foreground, and there's another guy in the background, and it's in the dark, so your brain is just kind of like struggling to understand what you're even seeing for
Yes.
a while. And that's so delightful. So this is a very good point you're making about just the emphasis on visual composition that goes into this.
But it's for different purpose as well. This is a comedy film. It is. It's a dark comedy. But one of the things that this, and it does it for comic effect. There are a number of times where it's really wonderfully done for comic effect. Like the snail guy is brilliant. Like the way that it's layered for the different things in the background, and the different things going on where the frogs are sat, so on and so forth. And there's other things like the apartment and all these different bits and pieces. But then it's also really happy to make you uncomfortable. or to throw in something that's going to sort of throw you off, and you'll be like, oh, happy, happy, happy. So, for example, the two things is we talked about the orgasm scene, which is everyone's building up, and it ends with like a close up of the butcher climaxing, and you're like, oh Christ, like that's in your face. Thank you for that. But more so is you met Louison, and you know, as you said, the guy's sort of like he's unusual looking, but he's not unattractive, you know, and you get used to his face and his appearance. And then you are introduced by the poster of him as his clown self. And it's a big old face, and it's kind of intimidating. It's, I mean, if you ever wanted to see, like, if you ever think like Tim Curry's, you know, Pennywise is freaky. It's got like intense eyes. He's got this accentuated mouth and all this other stuff. And you go, well, it's just a drawing. It's a drawing. It's fine. You don't really, you know, you don't really see him in that clown face. And then there's a dream sequence that Julie has, or a nightmare sequence, where you actually see him as his clown self with Livingston, and then it sort of accentuates. And there's a part where, like, part of Louison's head is on something, but it's a close up of his mask, like his makeup face. And it's really disturbing. Like, it really kind of caught me out, like this nightmare sequence. And I was like, because you're so used to seeing all these people's faces up close, that when you have this nightmare sequence, and it again shows you this up close face of Louison, but he's in his clown makeup. Like, it really could, it's really disturbing. But again, it uses those things of sort of the visual texture of what it's trying to tell you. And it gives you another area. It's like, oh, this isn't the reality that you've been in. This is a nightmare scape. So it's not another layer of weird, and you know, it's now going to be in shadow, and we're going to use this different, you know, this slightly different visual language. And so yeah, I just think it's really well done. Like, it's thought out, and I can imagine there are shots where they've gone, no, not that take. That doesn't work because of this. Like, this is managed in that way, but it feels organic and it still feels really well done. So no, I think it's you know, superb in that front.
Well, and you're right. All of the apartments are just sort of like so intricately manicured, you know, and the use of posters, the use of, you know, prints on the wall, you know, and you're right about the clown stuff, and you know, I think of that propaganda poster, but even the exteriors, you know, the delicatessen signs, you know, which are shot from these fascinating angles, you know, this sort of like wall next to it, you see people coming and going, getting their slices of meat, and you know, there's this battered wall that has, you know, the défense d'afficher, you know, which is like, you can't post anything on this wall. It's like you know, there are a lot of sort of like little gags like that in the background where it's like, really, you know, like obviously that's from the before days, but you know, it seems so bizarre that anyone cared about that, you know, in a post-apocalyptic world. Yeah, so I agree with you.
Yeah, no, it's a visual feast. But let's sort of let's get to the climax then. So that we've had this whole plot that the Julie wants to sort of save Louison, and so she integrates, or she engages with the troglodytes to bring them on board, and they are going to invade the apartment to save. They've already done once and made a complete piss poor job of it, and they've actually kidnapped the wrong person.
As one does.
Yeah, there's even
who hasn't done that?
There's an interesting scene that I think, you know, certain, I don't know, I'm not going to comment, but they kidnap.
Might not have aged well.
Yeah, well, there's a scene where they kidnap Madame Bourset, and they're kind of sort of, the guys going, here was the information we were given. Like, it's a guy, he's wearing this thing, it's a male, he's wearing, you know, he's got sort of this kind of thing, he's wearing clown shoes, blah blah blah. And they go, yeah. This is a woman. And the guy's like, well, is it? He's going, yes, it's
we
a
can't
woman.
tell.
Yeah, we can't tell. And he goes, can we tell? And so I thought that was kind of fun when the guy's like trying to sort of like get himself out of problems, going, well, you know. And then you're right, it sort of goes, the guy leans in to squeeze her boob, and it's sort of like, okay, that's to be fair, at least she gets to defend herself and try and bite him and stuff. But but then they do.
It's done for laughs, and you know, I mean,
yes,
the excuse is that they've gotten her in the right place, right, in the right apartment, but it's the wrong person, and how could they not have paid attention to all these other indicators? But you know, and then she but she sort of doesn't seem all that horrified to be, in a subterranean lair. And she keeps screaming, like, "What about me?" And
Yeah.
do we see her again, or is the last time we
No,
see her
that's the last.
wandering the sewers?
Yeah, that's the last you see because they actually start. She's
With no,
tied up. They cut the ropes to her and then they run off, and
Mhm.
then it reaches the finale where they're
And we see her
reinvading.
during the climax wandering the sewers
Yes,
alone, calling out for people. I suppose it's possible she just got lost and died in the sewers.
came out of the wrong place. Yeah, we never know what happened to her. But but in the building, it's all reached a climax. They are reinvading in order to capture Louison, but Julie has kind of changed her mind. At the same time, the postman's now turned up and he is engaging with the butcher because he wants to speak to and spend time with Julie, and everyone else is getting annoyed because Louison's not dead and he's not in their oven being cooked, basically. And this is kind of where it just becomes this farcical mess of
Mhm.
things happening that results in and also like I said, the rich couple, the woman at the top, is trying to commit suicide in multiple ways at the same time and fails. And that's where they get blown up, which seems kind of sort of like superfluous to the plot. It's just a gag.
Mhm.
Um, but I'm also, why was Louison filling the room full of water?
Oh, it's to make an escape, right? And so
Right.
it's borrowed from another film. So I mean, Louison and Julie are stuck in a room, and the mob, right, led
Yeah.
by the butcher, is outside the door, and they're trying to break down the door for quite some time.
Mm.
While you see cuts of everybody else, and basically they're like, all hope is lost. And it's not immediately clear, but what they've done is they sort of take clothing and they plug up a vent in the wall,
Hmm.
and that's so that the water won't leak through that vent.
Right.
And
Yes.
then they fill the entire room with water so that when the door is opened, it will knock everybody down and they'll be able to make their escape. Um, Except, of course, I mean, like, the weight of the water has undermined the floor, and then the floor collapses, and they're sort of trapped in this collapsed structure of a room.
Yeah. It's not the best plan, is it? Really, it feels a kind of like an ill thought out kind of plan that the water will do the. Okay, I didn't get that was the plan. I was like, I thought maybe they thought the building was on fire or something,
Yeah, they
or they
don't
could.
explain why, but they plug up that hole in the wall, and then he rips open the pipes,
Mm,
and they basically just float with the water. Um, yeah, no, that is the plan
right.
to make
That
their
does,
escape.
knowing it doesn't make it better. I think is
Yeah, I mean, okay, so it goes back to, the sort of like slapstick stuff,
yeah,
right? I
it
mean,
does.
this
It does.
belongs in a Charlie Chaplin movie. I mean,
Yeah, but that's where I think for all the visual stuff we've really lauded for this film, this is where it kind of, for me, it falls apart. Not completely, but like the chaos of it kind of feels a little bit messy, and you know,
see, I think the visuals of the water are great. I mean, like,
mm,
I found myself really amazed at, like, the water cascading down the stairs, and I'm like, this is a low budget movie. Like, you destroyed this building, you know, and then, the floor collapses, and I'm like, I'm wondering how they did that. And they're, holding on to the piping along the walls. And I'm like, and it's shot from underneath, and,
mm,
great angle. And, I think for me, the visuals work there. It's just a more farcical world than we've maybe been in for the rest of the
mm,
movie, right? Um, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And in a movie that is uh asks a lot of you as a viewer, that sort of doesn't explain everything right away, and you know, is willing to not spoon feed you all the answers. To not spoon feed you the answers here is one thing, but then when you figure out what's going on, and what's going on is just a farce, and kind of silly, as you say, it maybe is a little disappointing, or a little tonally out of sync with the rest of the film, or
yeah,
else alternatively just reveals it's just been a kind of farcical movie to begin with. It doesn't have anything to say about revolution or
No,
anything. It's just some fun characters doing some fun things.
which is fine. I think that's the thing, and I can accept it on that terms and stuff. But I think my problem is that because there hasn't been a plot and I've been following stuff along and stuff, when it sort of becomes the farcical sort of chaos at the end, I think I lose track of the visuals. And you're right, there are still some great shots. Well done. I lose track of that visual styling and that sort of lusciousness because I'm still trying to go, what the hell's going on? Why are they doing that? You know what I mean? I get a little bit lost in trying to keep up because I'm also reading the subtitles, which is no excuse, but I am sort of going,
No,
okay, well, I've got to read this. I've got to
that's
keep
real.
up. And
Yeah.
so I am sort of like I feel like I'm one step behind the pace of this finale. That then I'm like, okay, right, well, do you know, maybe that's more the struggle rather than I don't dislike it. It's more a case of it feels off kilter with the rest of the film.
Maybe maybe I'm a little more in pace with the finale, but I would say what I feel is I lose track of the characters, right?
Mm.
So there are so many characters at this point, and I'm like, oh, more troglodytes. Where are they in the building again?
Yeah.
Like, now, the butcher's hanging out of the, there's this fight on the roof, and the butcher's hanging out out of the off the roof, and he's seen through the window. He sees the troglodytes, and then he's outside the door, and because there are so many characters, I actually find myself wondering, who is this person again? Maybe this is my face blindness or something, but I there are so many characters that I find myself saying like, oh yeah, they're still locked in that room, right? I have to kind of make a mental note, and then it feels like I'm tracking characters and plot threads instead of just enjoying the movie.
I think very much the secondary characters. I mean, your primary character, the butcher, Julie Lewison, maybe sort of Madame Bourse. That's it. Everyone else is secondary characters. They become kind of background characters in the end. The end is really between those three, isn't it? That's sort of the point. So there's the older married couple are there, but it's kind of like shoulder shrugging. That could be anybody. They don't. Their sort of point is done. They've been the comic relief, or they've sort of served a purpose. But when the actual plotting and the step by step plotting comes in, they don't really serve a purpose. They're there, but they sort of don't do much. And so you're right, they don't need to track them. But that also adds to the fact of like, well, that tells me they're not important, and I don't like that because I think they felt important from other parts of the film. So I think it swings around. But you've got to bring the story to a close. It's got to address this cannibalism and this sort of the fact that Lewison is in threat. So you're going to address it. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it wants to do that sort of like mad world thing of just kind of like every character throw throw the kitchen sink in there too, literally, right? Where just sort of all this chaos is going on, and it kind of works, but I agree with you that it's sort of overwhelming. I think everybody kind of has something to do. I mean, like even that explosion, now that I'm thinking about it, that explosion does kind of cause the fight to change on the roof, right? I mean, so that's
it's what pushes the butcher off the edge, isn't it?
right. So that wins the fight for Louison. But and there are great shots. I mean, like peering up into the roof and stuff like that. I mean, it all it works on a kind of shot by shot basis, but that sense of chaos, that of sort of wild, uncontrolled chaos that it wants to capture. Maybe it's an editing thing. It's just a pacing thing. But I mean, you're right. There's too much happening. I think you can kind of get away with that if the editing is right and it's just minute by minute so entertaining and you're going with it, and but it just feels a little confusing.
Yes, no, I agree with that. But I'm still satisfied with the end product, if that makes sense. I get lost in it, but it doesn't detract from my enjoyment of the rest. Like sometimes you have film finales where you're like, oh, this is so sort of different, or sort of like poorly constructed that actually it kind of impacts the rest of the film. But I don't feel that with this.
Well, I think usually that's because those finales are where the movie was going, right? And so you're like, oh, really, this arc is going to end up here?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
that's what you were setting up? Where it's so disappointing. And I think here, there are a couple sort of like first act guns that go off in this third act, especially with the Australian weapon and
Mm.
stuff like that. But, the step, that doesn't work and things like that. But, it doesn't feel obtrusive. And so you
No.
sort of feel like the point of this movie was the characters and, the fun and all those little character scenes. This is just more character scenes in,
Mm.
a piled up farcical manner.
Yeah.
And if it is a little lackluster, that's okay because we've already had the heart of the movie. This is, more of the same.
Yes. No, agreed. Agreed. Okay then. So let's bring it down then to our sort. Let's wrap this up because we've been through it and we address an awful lot of this film. But so what are your final thoughts then? Let's bring it into final thoughts then for Delicatessen.
I mean, I like this movie. I think unfortunately it's kind of underwhelming, I think that it's a little bit of a sort of I mean, it's an early film that you can see a lot of traits of some of Amelie and things like this.
Mm.
You know. Um, but it has a lot of charm. It has its own unique vision. You're right that just shot by shot, it's fantastic.
Mm.
The characters are all interesting. You sort of want to see more with them.
Yeah.
It's like you could edit down that finale by, 5 minutes and put in, 20 minutes more in the middle, and probably we'd both be pretty
Yeah.
satisfied. Um, I mean, I could, do a 5 minute slapstick routine in the sewers with the troglodytes. I'd probably be pretty happy, you know. So this has a lot going for it. I think, it is just a sort of stunning movie visually in terms of its composition. It's very focused on audio. It's doing, a lot of layered stuff with like television and posters and weird perspectives. And I really admire it for all of those things. I think at the end, I kind of feel like it's lesser than the sum of its parts. It
Hmm.
doesn't kind of come together to mean anything more or feel like, oh, that, like at the end of Edward Scissorhands, I feel like that was a magical journey. That was a fairy tale I want to tell my kids about.
Yeah.
Um, I don't feel that with the ending of this. Does that make sense?
No, I agree. In fact, it echoes my thoughts, very much so. I think my satisfaction and pleasure for this film comes from enjoying it shot for shot. That thing of going through it and going like, that seems fun. I like that shot. Like I'm really, I'm invested in this film. It's not. I'm not sat there cold going, "That's a good shot. That's a good that kind of thing." I'm in the film, and because of the layeredness, because of the visual depth that it's been given, I've got a smile on my face. I'm watching it and going like, "I like these characters. They're quirky. They're weird. I love the fact that like the way this scene is presented and thought has gone into it. It's pulling me in. Like I'm enjoying these characters. Um, every sort of you said the depth of sort of stage setting and visuals are given to this thing of like we're going to that apartment and I can see things going on in the background, or we're going to the basement where I can see frogs and snails and like all this other weird shit going on. It's brilliant. Like it really sort of pulled me in where I'm like, oh, this is something I've been missing for a while. Is something this, as you said, the audio as well, the way that sort of that scene of them on the bed looking for the squeak and how it's choreographed and synchronized is just a joy. Like it's not perfect, but even its imperfections make it really, really good. It's just a nice scene and it works incredibly well. So yeah, there's just so much in the first sort of two acts that I'm so happy with, that when it gets to the third act and they're like, oh shit, we better have a bit of a plot, we better do something. It's fine. I'm still comfortable. It feels slightly different in tone, and the climax is a mess. And again, I think I'm going to come back to this and rewatch it at some point. Think, can I, because I know it, can I ingest it better? Like, is that sort of like now I'm expecting what I'm expecting from the third act? Am I able to sort of sit back and sort of lead into it rather than, because I'm watching it for the first time? So it's fine, but the characters still remain good. The fun, the fun of it's there, and The performances are good. The music and everything works together. This is, to me, I'm not the hugest fan of like art house and experimental kind of stuff because it feels too sort of off the wall at times. This is kind of my wheelhouse for what I would say would be like, oh, this is kind of like not arty, but like auteur. This is a visual kind of like this is someone's vision, and I'm invested in that vision. So, and if anything, I ain't gonna lie, having watched this and understanding it and discussing it kind of makes Alien Resurrection better. So just gonna put that out there. So no, I think this was a really good film. It's not, as you say, it's not perfect. And if I was to stand back and just say it as a film, as a whole piece, it is definitely lesser as a whole than it is for all the bits and pieces that go into it. So, but yeah, still very, very good, and glad I watched it.
Were you like me? Did you rewind lots of times? Did you
Mm-mm.
skip backwards and be like, "Oh, what was that on the wall?"
Yeah.
Like,
Oh,
that was over so fast. I want to see what that was.
yeah. There were multiple scenes in sort of places where, like you say, it sort of like pans round something, and you're like, "Hang on, what was that?" You sort of like, yeah, skip back a few scenes, just be like, "Oh, cool, that's there," or like that person's in the background, or yeah, this is good. Yeah, no, there were several times I did that just to really sort of like make sure I caught something. And I love doing that. I can imagine that being, watching this on the big screen in the cinema and being like, oh my God, like I've got to see that again. I want to make sure I see that. So yeah, no, it was a treat. This was an interesting treat.
Well, it makes me want to watch more by Jean-Pierre Jeunet, um, who also did, obviously Alien, also uh, City of Lost
Which
Children,
I've never seen.
Si Long
That's
Engagement,
yeah.
the very long engagement, but I haven't seen some of his more recent stuff, and I want to watch it, and
Mm.
I definitely feel like, in fact, there's another sci-fi one that he did, and a few sort of farcical ones. So
Okay.
um,
So yeah, it'd be interesting to
yeah,
sort
I'd
of
like to see more.
I wouldn't mind. I'm definitely gonna try and watch City of Lost Children. Sounds good. As obviously I think that was the one he did before Alien Resurrection came next after this, so I think that I want to see that progression, and I also want to return to Amelie because it's a film I haven't watched in like probably like 15 years.
I
Um,
love that film so
so,
much.
so I do need to go back and I think watch, and again now I can appreciate it. I'll probably appreciate it in a different way. So yeah, no, I would like to sort of try those out, and I might try more. We'll see. After a while, there's only so many French films and subtitles I can take, so we'll spread them out. I need to have my Marvel films in between them, Julian. I need to have that.
No,
I need to have those cheeseburgers. That's the problem.
yeah, I need my like Netflix,
Yes,
just
exactly.
fun TV shows. I'll watch, a
Yes.
season of that, and then be like, okay, I've steeled myself.
Yeah,
I'm ready for, another French subtitled movie that's demanding a lot of attention.
that's it. Exactly. I can take them in those chunks with my yeah. As long as my cholesterol is high enough after all the other garbage I'm ingesting. Anyway, we shall end on that. But that's been great. But this is it now. We're into the second half of our apocalypse season. We've got so much more to come. So yeah, so hang on there because we've got some dudes. And as Julian said, we're leading up to the road. So if you think this was sort of like conversation, I'm kind of looking forward to sort of how that's going to go. Because I am going to be reading the book for that as well.
But speaking of weird '90s visions that are allowed to be strange, it's up next on the main feed is Rachel Talay's Tanker from
Yes.
'95.
Yeah, that's a treat. Yeah, that's going to be interesting. Tori Petty and I'm going to go read some of the comics as well. I'm going to go. I've got them. They're available online, so I'm going to go and dip in and get some of those from Amazon and try some Tank Girl before we watch that.
I was a big fan of the comics.
I've read a few in the past, like in the 90s. I think around the time the film came out. So yeah, I'm interested to go back. I haven't read it for a while, so I'm interested to sort of tell. I love some of the art style in that as well. So interesting times. Anyway, for now, if you enjoy what we're doing, don't forget to leave a review on or comment on any platform. Let us know, engage. What do you think of Delicatessen? And what our thoughts upon it? Were we right? Were we wrong? Do you wish to agree with us and say that we don't understand cinema? I'm not going to get off that that thread.
Yeah, no, that has bothered me, you know. But really, if you recognize how brilliant we are, we desperately need to hear it. We have very fragile egos here at 20th Century Geek, and we need the affirmation.
That's it. Yeah, I just need just that pat on the back. Well done is all we need. Wonderful. But we have had some great feedback on this, and I appreciate any engagement, any comments. We really do. But if you do like it, leave a review somewhere else, on the different platforms, and go check out the Patreon. Because if you like these conversations, there are other ones over there. We talk about the Twilight Zone. We've gone through all the episodes of the Twilight Zone. We also do adjacent bonus episodes for different bits and pieces. And if this is the way that the French approach the apocalypse, you should really go see what we thought about the British when we talked about threads. We've done all kinds of different bits and pieces, so there's more to come on that as well.
Well, we also covered The Last Battle, which we liked less, but was another French apocalypse.
It is, yeah. No, I definitely prefer this to The Last Battle. Oh, yes, 100%.
Although both are able to do weird stuff, I have to say,
a near silent film, yeah, and both sort of. But again, the point I made in that was, if you're going to do a silent film, be visually interesting. Yeah. This film did both, and I think so.
Yeah, well said.
Yeah, but yeah, we got more to come. We got a load more to come. We got other things. One of the ones we've got coming, I'm really I'm kind of nervous about in a weird way, is When the Wind Blows. The British animation sort of a post-apocalypse film about nuclear war, and then we've got some other fun ones coming as well, including Six String Samurai and Hell Comes to Frogtown and some other bits and pieces. Anyway, that's the stuff that's coming. Go check it out. The things are out there. But for now, Julian, thank you very much for introducing me to this film and for this discussion.
Thank you, Scott.
And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening. Hope you enjoy it, and we shall see you again soon.